here we go. So I'm going to try to do something a little differently than I've ever really done before. And that means like you can only see like half my head because it's mostly going to be, I'm going to be doing a lot of stuff with my hands here. That's why that is. For some of you, that might be a gift. You're not having to see my face. Oh well, you're not going to hurt my feelings, but I've been planning the process of how to explain what I'm doing for a few days. And I think it kind of works, but I want some hopeful feedback here. And I want to look at the subject of Noah's Ark. And I want to do a rational examination of Noah's Ark. Now, I chose that name for a very specific reason, in that I'm not doing an investigation, like an evidentiary investigation or a discovery about it. I'm not going to be pulling up fossil records. I'm not going to be going answers in Genesis, Bill Nye, or anything. Like, I'm not going to be doing that kind of hard facts investigation. I'm going to be doing a kind of philosophical, rational examination of the claims themselves. Not necessarily the things that are tangibly connected to them, just the actual claims themselves of Noah's Ark. The kind of, or at least the fundamental claims. And it'll boil down to one major question. Did it happen? I think that's the thing that everyone tries to get and everything. That's the main categorical subject of the debate in this subject. Did it happen? And then you have, of course, the somewhat binary responses, right? Yes, it did, and no, it didn't. Yes, it did, no, it didn't. So you have like the atheists, the agnostics, there's a few evangelical whatevers out there that'll say, no, it didn't really happen. And then you have on the other side, you have the yes, it dids saying, yes, it did, it absolutely happened, global flood, cataclysmic flood, like, right, answers in Genesis, living waters, most pastors, I'd say majority of pastors throughout the country, or the Christian pastors around the world would say, yes, it really did happen, right? And that's kind of the battle lines, one side and the other. So I want to kind of follow that through. I'm going to begin with the opposition, or kind of the negative claim, I guess is the way I should say it, the negative claim, and look at that first, then I'll come across to the other side. All right, so no, it did not happen. Absolutely, it just simply did not happen. Okay, something that comes to mind is in that Netflix thing that Nye did. He actually just had a little Noah's Ark, whatever it was, diorama, children's toy thing. It's like, no, it did not happen thing. Like, no, it didn't. Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? No, it didn't. I think if that is your position, no, it did not happen, then why do we have this narrative? You say, well, it's in the Bible. And, well, of course, it's in the Bible. It's Genesis 6 through 9, right? But why do we have it? If it did not happen, absolutely did not happen, why is it in the narrative of the Bible? And they'll go in a couple of different directions with it. First off is that it was made up. Just completely, whole cloth, made it up. Or Epic of Gilgamesh has a similar narrative in it, right? They stole it. The ancient Jewish writers who originally transcribed the Old Testament, Book of Genesis, or that were kind of compiling and following it, right, do the copyist process, they stole it from another culture and just put it in there, right? Those are the two, like, hardcore positions. Now you're in the position of, but why do we have this story? Think about the comparisons to, like, the Epic of Gilgamesh, or to other ancient proverbial figurative narratives that are out there, other things that are just in the Old Testament as well. Why do we have that story? If you were to take 6 through 9, it goes from 5 to 10, goes, you have a genealogy and then jumps to Tower of Babel, essentially, right? If you just did that in chapter 11, if you just did that, no Noah story, just genealogy and then Tower of Babel, the story would almost kind of still fit narratively. You would have continuous family tree, hotspot story. That's kind of the story of Genesis anyways, right? So I don't think, if it was not there and it never was in there, then if it just did that, I don't know that anyone would even notice that there was a gap in the text. Kind of like how in Romans, you have 9 through 11 is this kind of sidebar section of the story that is, it goes from 8 to 12 almost without a hitch, right? It's almost like or you could say like in a narrative perspective or a literary standpoint, there are a lot of television shows, right, where it just has an episodic episode where it doesn't really connect to the overarching plot of the season, the series. It's just monster of the week, right? So I think if you want to consider yourself rational atheist, rational agnostic, rational negative position holder, then you have to kind of why do we have this precise story? And I think that it tends to degrade pretty quickly here with 3 different positions. Number 1 is I don't know, which is okay. I don't think anyone necessarily knows, other than, you have the divine revelationists, right? Or the, those who believe that the Bible is inspired and inerrant, right? But why, you can perfectly say I don't know to a point. The next thing, we can have a good, long, deep discussion. You and I, if you're an I don't know, maybe even call yourself agnostic there, I don't know, because we can talk about the fossil record. We can talk about answers in Genesis. We can talk about Bill Nye. We can talk about all those different source features and some of the evidence. Let's go to the Grand Canyon. Let's take a look at some of those strata layers, right? We can have a long, deep, and neither one of us necessarily changing our minds, but I don't think it's a good idea to stay there. I think at some point you do need to do a little bit more work. And the next thing is that it doesn't matter. If you slide that direction, you've kind of moved away from me. Often in the conversation with an I don't know, eventually the line gets dropped. I don't think it matters why. If that's true, you believe that it doesn't matter why the story is in there, it's just a made-up thing inside of a whole catalog of made-up stuff in there, it doesn't matter, then you and I are going to have a very difficult time having just a simple conversation about it, because there's kind of a lack of engagement from you about it. If that's your opinion, that can be your opinion, and then you take and then you kind of practically roll it out of I don't know and I don't think it matters. The last position is I don't know, it doesn't matter, and I don't care. If you are that position, I don't care either, you probably didn't click on this video, unless you just wanted to make fun of me, you wanted to make fun of me later. And if that's as well the case, you probably didn't even make it this far into it. So I'm not really even talking to you. But there's obviously an embedded hostility in the story. It doesn't matter. I don't care why it's in there. It's just child stories, fairy tales, right? And I think if that's your position, I don't care why. I don't think you have the right to claim that you're an intellectual dissenter about it, because quite frankly, That's not an intellectual position. Saying that you just don't care, that it doesn't matter, like those are not intellectual positions. They're emotional positions. So, enough of that. That's 10 minutes on that. Let's talk about the opposite side, just to come across. Yes, it did happen, right? There's the absolutist, the Sunday school attendant, Sunday school teacher, the average kind of seminary graduate pastor, right? Yes, it did definitely happen. God's word inspired, inerrant, right? And as a caveat, yes, it did happen, and it was global, right? Global cataclysmic flood. Well, you need to ask some questions as well. Number one, what about the fossil record? What about the strata layers, Grand Canyon, right? What about them? That's where, if you go to church, you go to Sunday school, whatever, they'll probably pull up resources from Answers in Genesis, from Living Waters, from various other sources like that, because on this side, those would be considered trusted sources, right? There are other things, but that's where they're going to go. I'm not saying that it's good. I'm not recommending it necessarily. I'm not detracting. I'm just saying that simple statement of facts, that's what happens, right? Well, let's say you've unraveled them a little bit about that. I think there's another question that you need to ask. What about China? What about Mesoamerican peoples that appear to have an unbroken historical record from supposedly about the time that this global cataclysmic flood was occurring? Now, there are Mesoamerican peoples that have a flood narrative, or a flood myth, maybe. Myth of history built into that. But I think that's where they will begin to hedge. Well, we don't know dating. Dating is not super effective. It's not as precise as we'd like to. Like carbon, radioactive, radiometric, decay dating, salt, concentrations in the ocean, right? Like there are various things that like they'll hedge, and in a lot of ways they're unfalsifiable claims, so they don't really add anything to the conversation. They just kind of undermine someone else's belief. Because, I mean, you could say, well, we don't really know we don't have, like, there wasn't a established inn at the cornerstone of any ancient buildings or anything, like the way that they do now with state buildings, with the little formed concrete 2006 whatever. Like they don't have that stuff. So we're, in a lot of ways, we're just guessing. We don't really know. And so if somebody places something on the Egyptian, the Chinese, the whatever timelines, it's a best guess. It's not necessarily a known fact. So they'll hedge in that way, right? Like I said, I don't know as far as how much that adds in value to the conversation. I think in some ways it's clearly backtracking, right? And then at the very end, and you're going to have a lot of atheists that kind of get at the very deepest root, right? Isn't this story just hard to believe? Hard to believe. And the answer is yes. Yes, it is. If someone's willing, like, you're going to get some pushback from the homeschool kids, from the Sunday school teachers, maybe. Like, you're going to get some pushback from a select group. But even Ray Comfort, even Ken Ham, even most honest pastors will be willing to meet you here. If you're an agnostic, you're an atheist or a dissenter or whatever, and you're coming into them with just this question, I think most of them will be kind of honest and vulnerable with you about that, right? And in good conscience to do so. It is hard to believe. However, just because just a couple of things to mention about that is, one, just because something's hard to believe doesn't necessarily mean that it's false. it's hard to believe that the Seahawks would throw the ball on the 1 yard line when they've got the an unstoppable running back in the backfield, right? It's hard to believe that they would do that. But they did do that. It's hard to believe that a team would blow a 28-3 lead at halftime, right? But they did. Like, there's a lot of things throughout. Like, it's hard to believe that you could get a bunch of people together to stack up rocks in the desert that are the size of buildings, practically. Like, I mean, just tons and tons of, like, cut stone in the middle of the desert, miles and miles and miles away from the quarry in which they were cut. It's hard to believe that they'd be capable of doing that, much less that they'd even want to do that. But they did do that, right? So it's not just because something is hard to believe does not mean that that thing is a false preposition. So that's a little bit of a hedge as well. I mean, just to be fair and just trying to be balanced, that is a little bit of a hedge. But it is true. I mean, you can grant that, like, and I think if we can meet halfway there, that's fine. I think we can shake hands there, and have a productive conversation about, like, well, it is hard to believe, but if you look at the rest of the narrative of the Bible specifically, you've got creation from nothing. Debates about how long that took doesn't really matter in the context of what I'm saying, where I'm going right now. You have creation from nothing. You have worldwide cataclysmic flood, right? You've got you have resurrection from the dead. You've got miraculous healings, water into wine. You've got fire from heaven. You have virgins giving birth. You have, like, you could say that it's just the narrative of the flood by itself is hard to believe. But it would seem to me, I mean, you've got people shouting walls down. You have a water that spurts out, or you have a rock that spurts out water, right? Manna from heaven. So, to suggest that, like, if it was the only story in the Bible that was hard to believe, then it would be much more difficult to believe on that grounds. However, if you look throughout the entire narrative, beginning to end, all throughout the Bible, woven through, is what I'd say hard to believe. A man kills a lot of people with a bone from the face of a four-legged animal, right? You have people killing hundreds or even thousands of soldiers single-handedly with things that are non-weapons, ox goads. Or you have a woman is raped to death, and then her body is cut into sections, and then UPS kind of sure-shipped all over the country to act as a call to action about a thing, right? There's just some stuff in there that's just like, whoa, right? And it's not uncommon. It happens quite a bit throughout the narrative. And so you can say, like, the numbers are different, but they're all the same suit. Or the image on the card is different, but they're all the same suit. And so in that way, no, they're not all the same value. No, they're not all the same. No, they're, like, and each one needs to be examined on their own merits. But it does seem to be a little bit of a collection of like fellows rather than it being a singular outlier. And so that's also where you have somebody from the oppositional or the dissentive or the kind of negative position will say, well, that's because the whole thing is whole cloth. And that sends you back into the question of, then why do we have any of it? If the whole thing is whole cloth, then why do we have any of it? And you can come up with, there are other hypotheses of why that is, but you should do some investigation as far as why that is. Like, at least try to answer the question on your own behalf. So, anyways, now those are the two lines. That's 10 minutes on each one. And I'm going to try my hardest to keep this last piece short. But those are the two battle lines, right? Trench warfare. And whereas the two sides tend to snipe at each other from a distance, both are deeply entrenched, both are deep in cover, and so nothing productive really comes out of doing that. But there is a middle ground, and you can call it no man's land, from the kind of trench warfare metaphor being extended. But it's really like that's where the real muck, that's where the real conversations, that's the real debates tend to happen, is that either, no, it didn't really happen, it was figurative. I think that's might be the least kind of sustainable or tentative position to take, because figurative of what? If it's like, no, the flood did not happen, worldwide cataclysmic flood did not happen, then and the whole story from 6 to 10 is just a figurative illustration of something, then what is it figuratively trying to illustrate? And you need a hypothesis, a theory, a something to explain that question. Figurative of what? Because if we have it, like some of the agnostics, atheists will say, like, no, it did not happen. But why do we have it? Because it was figurative. Well, figurative of what? Like, you could say the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Chronicles of Narnia, the Lord of the Rings, all these, like, those are clearly fictional, but they are deeply figurative, and you can say, like, it's very clear what those figurative illustrations are trying to tell you, what the point behind the points are, right? All right? Coming out of the trenches on the opposite side is the yes, it did happen, but, right? This is another instance where you kind of see some hedging, right? Is that it wasn't actually global. It was locally cataclysmic. I mean, you have in the Middle East, right, a lot of deep river valleys rimmed by mountains, so it is suspect but possible that it could have just flooded that entire plain, destroying it, and that it wasn't. There's also the theory that it, like, because they talk about the supercontinent Pangea, where the globe wasn't the globe back then, it was just one singular landmass, and so flooding that one landmass wasn't necessarily that hard at that time, and that this flood is what caused the beginning of the spreading of the continents to where they are today. It's a theory that I've heard, not remarking on its accuracy or anything, but that's a theory. And if so, that solves the global as well as the local issues. It also solves the kangaroo problem that Bill Nye likes to bring up. It also, like, it solves some problems. Why are there no kangaroo carcasses that are been found in Indonesia and stuff? Well, Indonesia didn't exist yet, or something. Like, it's like hedging still, just trying to be fair, hedging still, but it is a plausible explanation. But I think we can meet there. I think that if your position is yes, but, you and I can have a significant conversation, very productive conversation. If you are the no, but figurative, you and I, we can have a significant conversation, I think. If the only people that it is impossible to have a productive conversation about this subject is the yes, absolute, global, current, cataclysmic, as far as the way the continents are assembled right now, cataclysmic flood people that probably need a very large van to get to Sunday school on Sunday morning, and the I don't cares, the negative proposition, I don't cares, you've lost your minds, you're given into a fairy tale, right? Those are the only two people that it's impossible to have a conversation with. So I hope this has maybe been a little helpful. I hope that maybe that this has given you something to think about, to ponder. Where do you fall in this? What are the questions that are the most difficult for you to answer? And maybe we can talk about it. Because I do want some genuine feedback as far as kind of dissecting the process.